Since the first flicker of firelight against a cave wall, humankind has dreamt of permanence. We have shaped stone, bent rivers, and written names upon the earth so that time might remember us. Yet, no matter how high we build, the wind still whispers the same truth. Nothing lasts. Still we build, still we try. Long before maps, before nations, before written law, there were tribes who followed the rhythm of the seasons. Then, somewhere between the waters of the Nile and the banks of the Tigris, that rhythm changed. People stayed. They planted, harvested, stored, and waited. From the patience of farmers was born the ambition of kings. On the edges of the African desert, the Nile rose and fell like the heartbeat of creation. Its floods painted the land with black silt, rich and forgiving. Here, a people learned to read the river as scripture, to build in harmony with its pulse. Egypt became more than a place. It became an idea. That order could be carved from chaos, that the divine could live among mortals. The first pharaohs ruled not as men but as gods walking in sunlight. Their words commanded stone, their tombs reached for the stars. Beneath the blazing horizon, slaves hauled limestone blocks, their chants echoing like the thrum of eternity. The pyramids were not built merely to house the dead, they were promises that death itself could be mastered. For centuries, the Nile kingdom flourished. Art, science, and faith intertwined in golden balance. Then came the drought. The river shrank. Famine spread. The pharaoh's divinity cracked beneath the weight of empty grain stores. Rebellions flared, temples burned, and the desert reclaimed the fields. Egypt, the eternal, was swallowed by the sands it once commanded. Far to the northeast, where two great rivers threaded through a plain of mud and reed, another people drew lines in clay. Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, was a world of walls and words. Here the wheel was born, and with it, the notion that progress could be endless. Sumerian priests measured the heavens, scribes pressed cuneiform into tablets, and kings raised ziggurats toward a capricious sky. From these cities rose the first empire, forged by Sargon of Akkad. He bound rival towns beneath one banner, ruled through fear and law, and claimed dominion from sunrise to sunset. Yet when the rains failed and rebellion stirred, his creation shattered like unfired clay. Babylon rose from the ruins, its walls gleaming beneath a desert sun. King Hammurabi inscribed justice upon stone, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. His code outlived his crown. But the cycle turned again. The Assyrians swept down with iron and cruelty. Then they too were undone by overreach. Empires of Mesopotamia rose and fell as predictably as the rivers that sustained them. Each dreamed of eternity, each drowned in the flood of time. Centuries drifted by. Across the Aegean Sea, new voices awakened. Greece was a scatter of rocky peninsulas, poor in soil but rich in imagination. Its people looked outward, to the sea, to the stars, to the mind. They questioned the gods, reasoned about virtue, and measured beauty in the curve of marble. Athens became the jewel of this new world, democratic, eloquent, restless. Its citizens debated under the colonnades while its navy ruled the waves. Yet freedom bred arrogance. When Athens sought to bind her allies into subjects, the Peloponnesian War consumed her. Sparta's spears prevailed, but in victory, Greece was exhausted. The philosophers who had envisioned harmony watched their cities crumble beneath the weight of pride. Then came a storm from the north. Alexander, the young king of Macedon, carried Greece's dreams farther than its ships ever sailed. His armies marched across deserts and mountains, toppling Persia, crossing into India. Wherever he went, he founded cities and seeded them with Greek thought. For a moment, the world felt newly joined, a single civilization stretching from the Nile to the Indus. But the dream was his alone. and when he died, his generals tore it to pieces. The Hellenistic kingdoms that followed glimmered briefly, then faded into dust. Westward, on 7 small hills by a sluggish river, a new power stirred. Rome began as a village of shepherds, hardened by struggle. Its people learned early that survival demanded discipline. They built not for beauty, but for endurance. Straight roads, sturdy walls, iron will. The Roman Republic was a marvel of balance. Citizens bound by law, soldiers bound by duty. Each conquest funded the next. Each victory spread the promise of order. Rome's genius was not invention, but absorption. It borrowed Greek art, Egyptian faith, and Eastern luxury, weaving them into something uniquely Roman. The legions moved with machine-like precision, building fortresses as they conquered, roads as they retreated, bridges wherever rivers dared to slow them. A conquered people might curse the eagle's shadow, but they used its roads, traded in its markets, and found protection beneath its law. Yet within that strength, decay took root. Wealth flooded in from abroad, corrupting the republic's simplicity. Senators grew rich, generals ambitious. Civil war erupted, and the republic died upon the swords of its own guardians. From its corpse rose an emperor, Augustus, who draped monarchy in the language of liberty. Under his rule, Rome reached heights undreamt of. Marble cities, aqueducts like ribbons across the hills, an empire encircling the sea. For 200 years, the Pax Romana promised peace, prosperity, and permanence. But time erodes even marble. Greed hollowed the Senate. Soldiers sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. The frontiers stretched thin, the economy faltered, and plague devoured the heart of the empire. When the barbarians came, they found not strength but weariness. And so, in the 5th century after Christ, the city that had called itself eternal fell. The lights of Rome dimmed, and with them an age ended. Yet even in ruin, Rome endured, in its language, its law, its dream of unity. Far away in the east, another civilization had already mastered the rhythm of rise and renewal. In China, empire was not an exception. It was the natural order. The Yellow River Valley, fertile and treacherous, nurtured dynasties that rose and fell like the seasons. The Qin, fierce and unyielding, welded the warring states into one and built a wall so vast it could be seen from heaven. The Han followed, gentler and wiser, spreading roads and trade that reached the far lands of the West. Chinese scholars spoke of the mandate of heaven, a divine approval granted to virtuous rulers and withdrawn from the corrupt. When famine or rebellion came, it was said heaven itself had turned its face. Thus, every fall was both catastrophe and renewal. The empire was reborn again and again, each dynasty building upon the bones of the last. While Europe stumbled through its dark centuries, China's scholars mapped the stars, its artisans printed books, its merchants sailed to distant shores. The empire endured not through conquest alone, but through culture, a civilization so vast it absorbed invaders as easily as rivers absorb rain. And beyond its borders, new powers watched and learned. In the forests of Korea, in the islands of Japan, in the plains of Southeast Asia, the idea of empire took root, each adapting it to their own traditions, each dreaming of eternity. Centuries rolled forward. In lands where steppe met sky, nomads gathered beneath a single banner. From Mongolia's windswept plains rose a man whose name would echo in terror and awe. Temujin, known to the world as Genghis Khan. From the endless grasslands of the Asian steppe, a new sound arose. The thunder of hooves, the rush of wind across the plain, the drumbeat of destiny. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, had united the fractious Mongol tribes under a single banner, and from that unity unleashed a storm that would sweep across the world. His warriors rode with unmatched speed, striking like lightning and vanishing like smoke. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in weeks. The Silk Road, once a tenuous thread between East and West, became the spine of a continent-wide dominion. The Mongols destroyed, yes, but they also connected. Under their Pax Mongolica, traders and scholars could travel from China to Persia with a safety unknown for ages. Paper, gunpowder, and plague alike rode their caravans. For a moment, humanity glimpsed what a truly global empire might be. A world bound by movement, by exchange, by awe. But when Genghis died, his empire divided, and the centrifugal pull of ambition tore it apart. The grandsons who inherited his dream turned their swords against one another, and the horizon, once ablaze with conquest, dimmed to embers. Out of the fragments of that fire, new powers rose. In Anatolia, where East met West, a small frontier principality grew strong under the crescent moon. The Ottomans inherited both the ambition of Rome and the discipline of the steppe. With cunning and patience, they conquered the remnants of Byzantium and, in 1453, took the city that had stood for 1,000 years. Constantinople became Istanbul, the heart of an empire that spanned 3 continents. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire endured, a mosaic of tongues and creeds governed by tolerance and steel. Sultans built domes that kissed the clouds, and their architects filled the air with light. Caravanserais dotted the deserts, galleys ruled the Mediterranean. To the east, the Mughals did the same in India, blending Persian grandeur with Indian grace. In the 16th century, Emperor Akbar ruled from palaces of red sandstone and white marble. He gathered poets, philosophers, and mystics, seeking not conquest, but comprehension. His successors built the Taj Mahal, a tomb that seemed to float upon moonlight, a monument not only to love, but to the empire's exquisite confidence. Yet beneath the marble shimmered cracks. Religion divided what art had united. Courtly splendor masked rural misery. As wealth concentrated, loyalty dissolved. Meanwhile, on Europe's far western edge, tiny kingdoms gazed across an unending sea and felt the same restlessness that had driven the steppe riders long ago. The compass, the astrolabe, and the courage of sailors became new instruments of expansion. Portugal and Spain reached outward, their caravels cutting through the Atlantic winds. They sought trade and found worlds. In the Caribbean, in Mexico, in the mountains of Peru, empires older than their own awaited them. The Aztec and the Inca ruled with dazzling sophistication, cities of gold, roads carved through clouds. But they had never met guns, germs, or greed like this. In a handful of years, their civilizations were undone. From the ashes of those realms, Spain built an empire of silver and faith, stretching from the Andes to Manila. Gold poured into Europe, and with it, temptation. Where one kingdom prospered, others envied. France, the Netherlands, and England took to the seas. They came not as crusaders, but as merchants, carrying cannons in their hulls and contracts in their hands. The Atlantic became a corridor of commerce and cruelty. Across its waters moved not only spices and silks, but human lives. Millions were torn from Africa, their labor feeding the wealth of others. The empires of Europe were built on sugar and sorrow. For a time, the balance of the world tilted westward. Science blossomed, industry roared, and with them came a new conviction that progress itself was destiny. Nowhere did that belief burn brighter than in Britain. From a misty island, its ships fanned out like veins from a heart, pumping goods, language, and law to every shore. The British Empire claimed it brought order to chaos, civilization to savagery. Yet empire always carries its shadow. Beneath the rhetoric of improvement lay exploitation. Beneath the peace of the Pax Britannica, the echo of rebellion. Still, in sheer scale, it was a marvel. Steam and telegraph shrank the planet. A clerk in London could command a regiment in Delhi. A letter could outpace a storm. The sun, it was said, never set upon the British flag. And in that unending daylight, the modern world was forged. But history's pendulum never stops. In the factories that clothed the empire's citizens, new ideas took root. Liberty, equality, self-determination. Colonies learned their rulers' language and began to use it to demand their own freedom. Meanwhile, across the oceans, new empires stirred. The United States expanded westward under banners of manifest destiny. Russia pushed east into Siberia's frozen silence. The 19th century became a competition of giants, each seeking resources, markets, prestige. And in that fevered rivalry lay the seeds of catastrophe. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world was bound together by trade, treaties, and telegraph lines. And thus, when one empire stumbled, all trembled. The Great War that followed was not the conflict of nations alone, but of empires old and new. When the guns fell silent, Europe's map was redrawn in blood. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman realms dissolved. The British and French, though victorious, were hollowed out. Still, they clung to the illusion of permanence. They ruled through mandates and colonies, promising to uplift even as they extracted. Yet the world had changed. The age of empire by sword was ending. The age of empire by machine had begun. In Asia, Japan rose from isolation to dominance, fusing ancient discipline with modern industry. Its victory over Russia in 1905 stunned the world. A non-Western nation had defeated a European power. The myth of invincibility cracked. 2 world wars would finish the job. When the second of those cataclysms ended, the empires of Europe lay in ruins. Their colonies, long denied self-rule, demanded it with unanswerable force. From India to Africa, flags were lowered, anthems silenced, and new nations stepped into the light. Yet even as the old empires died, new ones were forming, not of land, but of ideology. From the rubble of Berlin and the ashes of Hiroshima, 2 superpowers emerged, each claiming to bear the torch of human progress. Between them stretched an invisible frontier, the Cold War, where influence replaced occupation and persuasion replaced conquest. The United States spoke of freedom, the Soviet Union of equality. Both sought converts, allies, dominions of thought. The world became a chessboard, and the pieces were human lives. Decade after decade, the rivalry shaped continents. Armies stood idle yet ready. Missiles slept in silos, and the fear of annihilation bound the planet together more tightly than any treaty. When at last the Soviet flag fell from the Kremlin in 1991, many believed the cycle had been broken, that empire itself was a relic. But power, like nature, does not vanish. It changes form. The new empires were not measured in miles, but in markets. Corporations spanned borders, currencies dictated policy, data became the new territory. The tools of empire were algorithms and satellites, contracts and supply chains. And as before, prosperity bred inequality, and inequality bred unrest. The empire of the modern age was everywhere and nowhere. Far from ending the story, the fall of the old empires had only transformed it. The world had entered an era of invisible dominion, where the struggle for power moved from fields to finance, from fortresses to networks. The actors changed, the pattern endured. The world stood blinking in the glare of peace, unsure whether it had survived or merely paused between storms. The old empires had been broken, but their shadows lay long across the new century. Colonies newly born into nationhood faced the paradox of independence. Freedom, yes, but freedom inherited from an empire's design. Borders drawn by strangers became lines of friction. Languages of conquerors became tongues of governance. the ghosts of empire lingered in every constitution, every railway, every school built to mirror a vanished crown. In Africa, the 20th century dawned as a time of awakening. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Algeria, names once dots on a colonial map, rose as voices, proud and uncertain, singing their nations into being. Some revolutions came with speeches and flags, others with rifles and blood. The cost of liberty was steep, and the debt to empire never fully paid. Yet amid the hardship, a new world began to breathe, one that would no longer accept subservience as destiny. In Asia, India became the jewel that slipped the crown. Gandhi's voice, soft yet unyielding, turned resistance into a moral force. When the Union Jack was lowered in 1947, it marked not only the end of British rule, but the twilight of imperial certainty itself. Around the same time, China's long struggle through war and revolution culminated in a new republic, red banners replacing the old dynastic dragon. The age of emperors was gone, yet the impulse to command remained, reshaped by ideology and steel. The middle of the century was an age of rebuilding and of rivalry. Europe, once the master of continents, now found itself divided, its cities rebuilt from rubble, its ambitions tamed by fatigue. Across the Atlantic, the United States assumed the mantle of leadership, speaking of democracy and progress. Across Eurasia, the Soviet Union raised the red flag of socialism and vowed to liberate the oppressed. The world held its breath as two visions of empire, draped in modern ideals, faced one another across oceans and skies. It was a strange kind of empire, no longer measured by territory, but by allegiance. Nations became pieces on a board of influence. Every revolution, every election, every satellite launch, a move in a game that spanned the globe. In Latin America, coups and counter-coups mirrored distant struggles. In Africa and Asia, wars of independence bled into proxy wars. The rhetoric of freedom masked familiar hierarchies. The machinery of domination had simply changed gears. Yet amid the tension, humanity achieved wonders. We split the atom and touched the moon, built machines that thought faster than we did, cured diseases that had stalked us for millennia. The same ingenuity that once raised pyramids now launched rockets. For a moment, it seemed possible that empire's lessons, its grandeur and its folly, might finally be transcended. But progress carries its own gravity. The technology that freed us also bound us tighter together, linking economies, cultures, and crises in webs invisible yet inescapable. By the 1970s, the great ideological empires were showing cracks. The Soviet Union groaned under the weight of stagnation. America reeled from war and doubt. Revolutions ignited in Tehran, Managua, Saigon. The empires of the mind were faltering. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it was not just concrete that crumbled. It was a vision of certainty. The world exhaled, believing history itself had reached its calm horizon. But history never rests. In the vacuum left by superpowers, new centers of influence arose. Europe sought unity through cooperation, turning former rivals into partners. China, opening its gates to trade, began an ascent as breathtaking as any in antiquity. The Middle East, long carved by outsiders, became a crucible once more, its sands soaked in the legacies of oil and faith. The 21st century dawned not as the end of empire, but its reinvention. This new empire wore no crown, raised no flag, and fielded no army. It was woven of circuits and capital. The merchants who once sailed wooden ships now steered digital fleets, their cargo invisible, data, attention, influence. A handful of corporations came to command resources greater than many nations. A teenager in one country could shape the opinion of millions in another. The empire of connectivity promised equality and delivered dependence. Its power was soft, pervasive, and inescapable. And still, as before, the familiar rhythm pulsed beneath the surface. Expansion, consolidation, corruption, decline. The signs appeared, inequality widening, trust eroding, truth itself contested. The map may have changed, but the pattern had not. The empires of code and finance faced the same test that felled Rome and Babylon, whether they could balance strength with virtue, reach with restraint. Far from the gleam of city lights, other forces gathered. Climate, long the silent partner of civilization, began to speak again in storms and droughts. History's oldest adversary, nature, returned to remind us that even global empires rest on fragile ground. The rivers that nurtured Egypt now ran low. The glaciers that fed Asia's great civilizations retreated. As the planet warmed, borders blurred, and the notion of sovereignty itself seemed less solid than the melting ice. Through it all, humanity continued to build. New towers rose, higher than the ziggurats of Sumer or the cathedrals of Europe. Our cities became constellations of glass and light. We reached beyond the atmosphere, planting our instruments on other worlds, as though empire might find its final refuge among the stars. Yet wherever we go, we carry the same heart, the same longing to create order from chaos, the same peril of believing that order will last forever. Every generation inherits the ruins of the last and imagines them lessons rather than warnings. We study the fall of Rome and promise not to repeat it. We analyze the mistakes of colonizers and vow to be different. And yet, the cycle endures. Perhaps the truth lies not in escaping the rhythm but in learning to dance with it, to build knowing that decay will follow, to rule with humility rather than hubris. Empires are mirrors. They reflect the best and worst of who we are. In their rise, we see our brilliance. In their fall, our blindness. They teach that greatness is never a birthright but a balance, fragile as a flame. The moment we believe our structures eternal, they begin to crack. The moment we accept their mortality, they may endure a little longer. Across the world today, remnants of empire stand silent. Aqueducts tracing Roman valleys, railways slicing through Indian jungles, fortresses half swallowed by desert. Tourists wander their corridors and marvel at the hands that built them. Those hands are gone, their empires dust, yet the dream persists. It is the dream that drives a scientist in a lab, a programmer at a keyboard, a farmer coaxing life from barren soil. The dream that what we make might outlast us. Centuries have passed since the first bricks of Babylon, and still we build. The tools change, the impulse does not. From stone to steel, from ink to code, each generation adds its layer to the great edifice of civilization. And always time waits with patient certainty, ready to test our work. As we look back across the millennia, the pattern emerges not as a curse, but as a conversation between permanence and change. The Egyptians sought eternity in stone, we seek it in data. The Romans paved roads, we pave information highways. The Mongols connected continents by horse, we do so by fiber optic thread. The essence is the same: to connect, to control, to continue. Perhaps the lesson of empire is not that we should stop building, but that we should build with memory, with an awareness of the dust beneath our feet and the sky above our reach. Every empire falls, but not every legacy must vanish. If we carry forward wisdom instead of arrogance, empathy instead of domination, perhaps the next cycle will rise a little higher before it descends. And so, as this century unfolds, we stand again at a familiar threshold, between creation and collapse, hope and hubris. The wheel turns, as it always has, but within each revolution lies the chance for grace. The ruins behind us whisper not only warnings, but possibilities. Empires rise, empires fall, and through their rhythm, humanity learns, slowly, painfully, beautifully, to endure. Empires rise, empires fall, and through their rhythm, humanity learns, slowly, painfully, beautifully, to endure. Yet the story does not end in the present. Beyond the horizon of today's world lies the uncharted country of tomorrow, where new forms of power wait to be born. For empire has never been only a thing of soldiers and stones. It is an instinct, an inheritance that moves through us like the tide through the moon's pull. Already the outlines of future dominions shimmer on the edge of imagination. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum networks, these are the new frontiers. They promise liberation, but they also whisper conquest. Data may become the tribute of tomorrow. Algorithms, the new legions. Memory, the currency of control. Every click, every thought recorded and refined, tiny offerings to invisible empires of code. Far above the clouds, satellites trace bright paths, silent sentinels circling a restless planet. They watch our cities glow like constellations, mapping our triumphs and our mistakes. From such height, the differences that divide us seem to blur, yet from that same vantage, our ambitions look achingly familiar. We expand, we claim, we name. We fill the dark with our signatures and call it progress. And perhaps it is, for progress and empire have always been siblings, bound by both wonder and greed. Each discovery births a new dominion, each invention a new dependency. The fire that warmed the first village also forged the first weapon. The ship that carried trade also carried conquest. The network that connects us may yet enslave us to our own creation. But the future is not a sentence. It is a question. What kind of empire will we build next? Will it be one of domination or of understanding? Can humanity, at last, learn to rule without oppression, to lead without pride? The answer will not be written by kings or codes, but by the quiet choices of billions. Centuries from now, when archaeologists of another age sift through the sediment of our time, what will they find? Perhaps the skeleton of a city drowned by the sea. Perhaps a fragment of a satellite fallen from orbit. Perhaps the faint pattern of a microchip pressed into the fossil of a desert stone. Will they wonder, as we wonder about the ancients, who we were and what we sought to become? They will see that we, too, were dreamers of permanence, that we etched our symbols upon everything we touched, the walls of caves, the faces of mountains, the cold void of space. They will see our monuments, towers that scraped the sky, machines that thought, songs recorded in invisible waves. They will see, perhaps, that even in our failures, we reached for the divine. Empires are not only built upon the earth. They are built within the human heart. The drive to explore, to organize, to shape meaning from chaos. These are the empires that never die. Every teacher, every artist, every parent building a life for a child is part of that same eternal construction. Their empires are of kindness, of knowledge, of memory. They too rise and fall, but in their falling, others rise. Somewhere a child looks up at a ruin, a colosseum, a pagoda, a broken arch swallowed by vines, and asks what it was. The answer, though wrapped in centuries, is simple. It was us. It was what we could do when we believed we were forever. It was what we lost when we forgot how brief forever is. And in that realization lies the seed of wisdom. For the lesson of empire is not despair but humility. It tells us that power is fleeting, but meaning is not, that beauty outlives conquest, that art outlasts law, that compassion outshines dominion. Every empire that has ever fallen has left behind the same whisper. Remember. Remember that you are dust, and that from dust you may yet create wonder. If we can remember, perhaps the next rise will be gentler, the next fall less cruel. Perhaps we will learn to build not for glory but for grace, to measure success not by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it touches the human spirit. The wheel will still turn, but we may at last turn it consciously, aware of the weight of our own hands upon history. And when the final empire fades, when the last satellite burns in the upper air, when the last tower collapses into the earth, when the last digital signal flickers into silence, what will remain? Not the monuments, not the borders, not the flags, only the stories. The stories we told to make sense of our striving. The stories of those who built and those who dared to begin again. Stories like this one. Because in the end, it is not empire that endures. It is humanity's refusal to stop imagining. That is our true inheritance, our final rebellion against oblivion. We rise, we fall, we rise again, not as conquerors, but as creators. Each generation, a new dawn upon the same ancient earth. Empires rise, empires fall. But the dream that built them, the dream that we might touch eternity, if only for a moment, still burns. And as long as that flame survives, the story of humanity will never end.